Everyone froze when a general's twin sons ran through a crowded hospital hallway and called a quiet nurse by a name nobody there had ever heard, a name that belonged to the storm that once saved their lives. If you love a story about the person everyone underestimated turning out to be the reason a family is still alive, this one's for you. Like this video, drop a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from, hit subscribe if you haven't already, and if this story moved you, help it find someone else who needs it. Hype it up and share it around. Welcome to Emergency 911 Stories. You do know how to draw blood, right, Doctor? Grant Holden said it loud enough for the whole nurses' station to hear. Callie Marsh kept her eyes on the chart. She didn't answer. Because that line took you 4 tries. Holden tapped his pen against the counter. 4. A resident snickered. Callie set the chart down, straightened the tourniquet tray and said nothing. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. That was the part nobody noticed. Bright cobalt scrubs, hair pulled back in a tight ponytail, a small silver wing pin clipped low on her chest pocket, half hidden under her badge. Nobody asked about the pin. Nobody ever did. Ash Grove Regional was a Level 1 trauma center 40 minutes from Fairmont Air Force Base, which meant military families came through these doors more than most hospitals ever saw. Callie had worked here 3 years, quiet, competent, forgettable if you didn't look too closely. Holden liked to look closely. He liked finding cracks in people who couldn't fight back. "I don't have time to babysit," he said, walking away. "Try not to kill anyone today." Behind the nurses' station, an older nurse named Priya leaned in. "He's like that with everyone." "I know," Callie said. "You never let it land, though." "How?" Callie almost smiled. "Practice." What Priya didn't know was that Callie Marsh had once held a screaming child above her head in 15-foot swells, while a fishing trawler broke apart around them. Holden's voice was nothing. A gnat, static on a channel she'd stopped listening to a long time ago. 6 years ago, she'd had a different name for moments like this. A call sign. Not a job title. Kingfisher. Nobody at Ash Grove had ever heard it, that was the point. The overhead speaker crackled. "Trauma team to Bay 4, incoming VIP escort, ETA 6 minutes. Holden straightened his coat like the cameras were already rolling. "VIP, he repeated, pleased with himself. "I'll take lead on this one." Callie clocked the radio traffic without meaning to. Old habit. Chief complaint, chest pain, decreasing blood pressure, distended neck veins. A pattern she recognized instantly, the way some people recognized a song from 3 notes. Beck's triad. Muffled heart sounds. Low blood pressure, jugular distension, cardiac tamponade. And it was moving fast. She didn't say it out loud. Not yet. Nobody would believe an ER nurse could hear a chief complaint over a radio and already know the diagnosis before the patient hit the doors. So she stayed quiet, and she got ready anyway. She checked the crash cart out of habit. Pericardiocentesis tray. Present but buried 2 shelves down, exactly where it always sat. Exactly where it was never needed. Until it was. Her pulse didn't climb. It never did in moments like this. It only climbed afterward, alone, in a supply closet, where nobody could see her hands shake for the first time all day. Outside, sirens grew louder, cutting through the ordinary hum of the ER. A convoy, not an ambulance, black SUVs, a police escort. Through the sliding doors, Callie caught a flash of dress blues and stars on a shoulder board before the crowd swallowed the view. 4 stars, Priya breathed, reading the radio call sheet. General Marcus Whitfield, Air Force. The name hit Callie like a dropped tray. Whitfield. She hadn't heard it spoken aloud since that debrief room on a base she wasn't allowed to name, not since a mother's voice cracking with gratitude while 2 small boys clung to a rescue swimmer's soaked flight suit. Colonel back then, not general. Different rank, same eyes, if the file photo she'd glimpsed once was any indication. Pale blue, steady, the kind of eyes that didn't panic even when the boat was going down under him. She hadn't known his name was Whitfield until years later. In the water, in the dark, with waves breaking over both of them, names hadn't mattered. Only grip strength. Only who let go and who didn't. She never let go. She kept her face still. She'd trained for stillness longer than she'd trained for almost anything else. That was a long time ago. Long enough for a name to stop meaning anything to most people. Not to her. The doors burst open. Aides in uniform flooded the bay, shouting for a doctor, for a gurney, for anyone. Holden stepped forward first, chin high, already performing competence he didn't have. Callie moved without being told to. She always did. Holden barked orders that sounded right and weren't. Wide-open IV fluids on a patient with tamponade physiology was the fastest way to make things worse, not better. But nobody was going to correct the attending in front of an audience of aides and stars. Callie grabbed the pericardiocentesis tray without asking permission. She set it on the counter within reach, quiet, deliberate, the way you stage a tool you already know you'll need in 90 seconds. Priya caught her eye. "You think it's that bad?" "I think we're about to find out," Callie said. Somewhere behind the wall of uniforms, a general who did not yet know her face was fighting to breathe, and a story that started in the middle of a storm 6 years ago was about to catch up with both of them. The doors opened, and the general came through on a gurney, grey-faced, one hand pressed flat against his own chest, like he could hold his heart together by force of will. 2 aides talked over each other. A colonel barked his rank and blood type like it would help. Somewhere in the noise, a dog barked once, short and sharp, then went quiet on command. Holden pushed to the head of the bed. "Get me 18-gauge access, wide open, both arms." Callie's stomach dropped, exactly what she'd feared. "Sir, his pressure's already low and his neck veins are up," she said, low, close to his ear, not for the room to hear. "Wide-open fluids won't help a tamponade. It'll drown him faster." Holden didn't look at her. "I didn't ask for a differential from a nurse." The monitor answered for her, blood pressure sliding, heart sound so muffled the resident with the stethoscope frowned and rechecked the leads, certain they'd failed. They hadn't failed. The heart was drowning in its own sack, pressed so tight it could barely beat. 6 years ago, in water black as oil, Callie had felt a heartbeat like that under her palm. A woman, mid-30s, ribs crushed against a snapped railing, taking on water in a life vest 2 sizes too big. Callie had pulled her free with one arm and kept both boys above the surface with the other, screaming a call sign into a radio soaked through twice. "Kingfisher, be advised, package secure, 3 souls, repeat, 3 souls." Nobody on that channel had known her real name either. That was how the Coast Guard trained you. Names got you found. Call signs kept you alive. The storm had taken the boat down in under 6 minutes. Callie remembered the cold hitting like a wall, remembered counting heads in the water by torchlight, remembered a man's voice on the radio, calm even as his own boat broke apart beneath his family, giving her exact headings without a single wasted word. She hadn't known then that the calm voice belonged to a colonel. She only knew it belonged to someone who trusted her to bring his sons home, sight unseen, before he'd ever laid eyes on her face. She'd carried that trust in silence for years without telling a single soul at Ashgrove. It had never once occurred to her that it might walk back through a set of ER doors on a gurney. Back in Bay 4, the general's oxygen numbers dropped again, and this time even Holden's face changed. "BP 68/40, Priya called out. "He's tachycardic, 140. "Get cardiology down here," Holden snapped, already backing away from a problem his training hadn't prepared him for. Cardiology was 11 floors up and 4 minutes out on a good day. The general did not have 4 minutes. Near the doorway, a young airman held the leash of a military working dog, the animal's ears pinned flat, sensing the panic in the room before most of the humans caught up to it. Its handler kept a hand on its shoulder, steady, low, the way you calm anything that reads a room better than people do. An aide near the wall spoke fast into a phone, voice pitched to someone important. "Sir, I need to update the Pentagon liaison. The general is—" He stopped talking when Priya shot him a look sharp enough to cut glass. Another aide, younger, barely into his 20s, pressed his back against the wall and stared at the monitor like it might change its mind if he wanted it badly enough. Callie didn't have room in her head for any of them. She had room for one number dropping and one window closing. Callie looked at the monitor, then at the man on the table, then at the small silver wing pin under her badge that she never explained to anyone. She thought of a mother's voice on a dock years ago, thanking a swimmer whose name she never learned. She thought of 2 small boys who used to call her by a name that wasn't hers, back before either of them could spell it. She stepped forward. "I need the pericardiocentesis tray open now," she said. Her voice had changed. Flatter, steadier. A voice built for chaos, not for hallway gossip. Holden turned, incredulous. "Excuse me." "Fluid around his heart is going to stop it in the next 60 seconds if nobody drains it," Callie said. I can do it. I need you to let me." The room went still in a different way than before, the kind of still that happens right before someone decides whether to trust a stranger or watch a man die on principle. "You're a nurse," Holden said, like the word itself was a disqualification. "And you're out of time," Callie said. 60 seconds, maybe less. You can watch me do it or you can watch him code. Pick one." Priya was already at her side, snapping open the sterile kit without being asked. Betadine swabbed across pale skin in one clean motion. Somewhere behind them, an aide was still talking to a phone nobody needed anymore. Halden's jaw worked. Pride and fear crossed his face in equal measure, and for one long second neither of them won. The general's monitor screamed a warning tone that needed no translation. Callie didn't wait for permission twice. Callie's hands moved before her mind finished the sentence. Landmark first. Subxiphoid angle, 45 degrees, aimed toward the left shoulder. She'd done this on a rolling boat deck once in the dark. With 2 hands and no monitor, a trauma bay with lighting and a heart rhythm strip felt almost generous. 16-gauge long spinal needle, she said. Priya had it in her palm before the sentence ended. "What are you doing?" Holden's voice cracked on the last word, somewhere between a question and an order. He no longer had the authority to give. "Draining the sac before it stops his heart," Callie said. "Watch the rhythm strip. Tell me if you see ectopy." She swabbed the skin herself. Quick, sure, no wasted motion. The needle went in below the sternum, angled up and left, aimed at a target she could see in her mind the way other people saw a familiar street. The room held its breath. Even the monitor's beeping seemed to slow, or maybe it was just her. The way time always narrowed to a single point right before it mattered most. Fluid began to draw back into the syringe, dark, red-tinged, and Callie felt the pressure under her fingers change before the numbers on the screen caught up. "BP's climbing," Priya said, disbelief breaking through her professional calm. 90/60, 94/62. "Heart sounds are back," the resident said, stethoscope pressed hard against the general's chest like he didn't trust his own ears. "I can actually hear them now." Callie kept her eyes on the syringe, on the fluid, on the numbers, drawing slow and steady until the pressure eased and the general's breathing deepened on its own for the first time since the doors had opened. 60 milliliters. Sometimes that was the whole distance between a man living and a man not. The general's eyes fluttered open, unfocused, then found her face and held there. "Where?" he rasped. "Did you learn to do that?" Holden stood frozen at the foot of the bed, the pericardiocentesis tray he'd never once reached for, still sitting untouched on the counter where Callie had staged it 10 minutes earlier. "She just saved your life, sir," Priya said quietly, before Callie could answer for herself. The general's gaze didn't move from Callie's face. Something in his expression shifted, confusion folding into something closer to recognition, though he couldn't place why. "I know that voice," he said half to himself. "I know that voice from somewhere I can't—" An overhead page cut through the moment, calling for hospital administration to Bay 4, and Callie used the interruption to step back, strip her gloves, and let the trauma team close in around a patient who was, for the moment, stable. She caught Holden's eye across the bed. He looked away first. It wasn't triumph, she felt. It never was in moments like this. It was the old, familiar quiet that came after doing the thing nobody else in the room could do, the quiet she'd learned to carry alone for 6 years. Priya followed her out into the hallway, voice low. "Callie, where did you actually learn to do a pericardiocentesis freehand, under pressure, with an audience of 4-star generals?" Callie pulled off her second glove and didn't answer right away. "Long story," she finally said. "I've got time." "I don't," Callie said, not unkindly, and walked toward the supply closet where, for exactly 90 seconds, she let her hands shake the way they always did after, safely out of sight, before splashing cold water on her face and going back to work, like nothing had happened at all. Behind her, word was already spreading through the ER in the particular hush of a story too strange not to repeat. Nobody had the details right yet. That never lasted long in a hospital. By the time the hospital's chief administrator arrived to personally check on the general, 3 separate versions of what had happened in Bay 4 were already circulating, and every single one of them ended with the same unanswered question. Who was that nurse? Hospital Administrator Diane Coyle found Callie restocking a supply cart 20 minutes later, hands finally steady, face carefully blank. "You performed an invasive cardiac procedure without a physician's order," Coyle said, not unkindly, but not warmly either. "I need to understand how that's possible before I can let you go back on the floor." "He was dying," Callie said simply. "I stopped it. That's not the part I'm questioning." "Dr. Halden filed an incident report," Coyle added. "He's requesting a formal review of your credentials." Callie nodded slowly, unsurprised. Halden had spent 3 years looking for a crack in her. Now he had one, even if it was shaped like the thing that had just saved a general's life. "Understood," Callie said. "I'll cooperate with whatever you need." "Good," Coyle said, softer now. "Because General Whitfield's chief of staff is already asking questions I don't have answers to. He wants to speak with the nurse who treated him, by name." Something cold moved through Callie's chest, quieter than fear, closer to inevitability. She had spent years building a life where nobody asked her that question, where the past stayed in the water, in the dark, in a call sign nobody at Ashgrove had ever heard spoken aloud. That life had just run out of runway. "Tell him I'll be available," Callie said, and went back to restocking the cart with hands that for once weren't entirely steady at all. By evening, a local news van had parked outside Ashgrove's main entrance, drawn by a leaked scanner call about a 4-star general and a mystery nurse. Coyle had security turn them away from the building, but not before a reporter got a blurry photo of Callie leaving through the staff exit. Callie saw the photo online that night and felt the old, familiar instinct rise in her chest, disappear, change cities, start over somewhere nobody would ever again call a code over a hospital radio, and make her hands remember things she'd spent years trying to set down. She didn't do it. She sat with the feeling instead, the way she'd learned to, and let it pass. The credentialing review happened the next morning in a small conference room that smelled like old coffee. Coyle sat at the head of the table. Halden sat across from Callie, arms crossed, jaw tight, a man bracing for vindication that wasn't coming. "Ms. Marsh," Coyle began, "your personnel file lists 3 years of civilian nursing experience prior to Ashgrove. It does not mention any military service, EMS background, or advanced procedural training. I need you to explain the gap." Callie folded her hands on the table. "I served 6 years as a Coast Guard rescue swimmer. Advanced trauma and tactical medicine were part of that training. I left the service under an honorable discharge and chose not to disclose it when I was hired here." Halden leaned forward. "Why hide something like that? Unless you weren't supposed to be doing procedures you weren't licensed for." "I was licensed for exactly what I did," Callie said evenly. "Field medics and rescue swimmers train on invasive procedures civilians rarely see, because in open water there's no cardiologist 11 floors up. I hid it because the moment people know what you used to be, they stop seeing what you are now. I wanted to be a nurse, just a nurse." The room was quiet for a moment. Even Halden had nothing sharp to say to that. What Callie didn't say, because it wasn't Coyle's business and it wasn't Halden's either, was the rest of it. A mission 8 months after the Whitfield rescue, a different storm, a different family, and a teenage boy she hadn't reached in time. She'd done everything right, it hadn't mattered. Some nights she still heard the silence on the radio where his voice should have been. She'd requested reassignment to a training billet after that. 6 weeks later, she'd requested separation instead. Nobody at the review board had questioned it. Burnout was common enough in her line of work that it barely needed explaining. She hadn't called it burnout to herself. She'd called it a debt she couldn't pay down by staying. Civilian nursing had felt like penance at first and safety second. Steady shifts, no storms, no radios crackling with names that weren't hers, just ordinary people, ordinary emergencies, and hands that finally got to rest between crises instead of living inside one permanently. Ashgrove had given her 3 years of that. 3 years was longer than she'd expected the disguise to hold. "There's another matter," Coyle said carefully, sliding a printed message across the table. "General Whitfield's office called again this morning. He's being discharged tomorrow, and he's requested that hospital staff be present for a brief visit before he leaves. He specifically asked that you be there." Callie's stomach tightened. "Did he say why?" "No," Coyle said. "Only that it was important, and that his sons would be with him." Halden scoffed. quiet but audible. Sons. What does that have to do with any of this? Callie didn't answer. She was already years and 3,000 miles away, back on a deck slick with rain, holding two small boys above rising water and promising them, in a voice she'd built specifically for moments like that she wasn't going to let go. She hadn't let go then. She wondered, sitting in that quiet conference room, whether she'd have any choice about letting go of her careful, ordinary life now. "I'll be there," Callie said. Coyle studied her for a long moment, the incident report and the review forgotten between them. "For what it's worth," Coyle said, "whatever review this triggers, I don't think it ends the way Dr. Heldon's hoping it does." Halden stood abruptly, chair scraping against tile, and left without another word. It was the closest thing to a retreat Callie had ever seen from him. Coyle gathered the incident paperwork into a folder she didn't bother closing. "Get some rest tonight, Miss Marsh. Whatever tomorrow turns out to be, you'll want to be steady for it." "I'm always steady," Callie said, and almost believed it. That night she sat alone in her apartment, with the small silver wing pin turned over in her palm, catching lamplight. She thought about two boys' faces she hadn't seen in 6 years, faces that existed in her memory, only as small and frightened and soaked through with salt water, and wondered what 10-year-old versions of them would even look like now. She thought about a promise made over a dying radio channel in a storm, a promise she'd never expected to have to keep in a hospital hallway. Tomorrow, she decided, she would keep it anyway. The trauma wing was crowded by mid-morning, more crowded than Callie had ever seen it. Airmen in dress uniform lined the corridor near Bay 4. A K9 handler stood near the wall, his working dog sitting alert at heel, ears tracking every new sound. Doctors and off-duty nurses had gathered too, curious, drawn by a story that had spread through the hospital overnight, in a dozen exaggerated versions. General Whitfield sat at a small table near the nurses' station, out of his hospital gown now, dressed again in dark blue service uniform, 4 silver stars catching the fluorescent light. A garrison cap and a coffee mug sat in front of him, untouched. He looked recovered. He looked more than anything like a man waiting for something. Callie approached slowly, badge in place, ponytail pulled tight, scrubs the same bright cobalt blue they'd been the day before, as if bright cobalt blue could make any of this feel ordinary. "General Whitfield," she said, "I'm glad to see you up." He studied her face the way he had in the trauma bay, searching for something just out of reach. "I owe you my life, Ms. Marsh. I intend to make sure the right people know that." "You don't owe me anything," Callie said. "I was just doing my job." Before he could answer, the crowd near the entrance shifted, parting the way crowds do for something small and fast, and utterly unconcerned with protocol. 2 boys broke away from their mother's hand and ran, not toward their father, toward Callie. "Careful, boys," their mother started, but they were already there, small arms wrapping around Callie's waist, faces turned up toward hers with an expression somewhere between disbelief and pure, uncomplicated joy. "It's her," one of them said, breathless. "Eli, it's her. It's really her." The other boy stared up at Callie's face, at her ponytail, at the small silver wing pin on her chest pocket, and his eyes went wide. "Kingfisher," he said. The word landed in the hallway like a dropped tray, and this time it wasn't only Callie who froze. General Whitfield rose halfway out of his chair, coffee forgotten, garrison cap sliding off the table unnoticed. Every airman in that corridor turned. The K9 handler's dog let out a single sharp bark before its handler's hand found its shoulder again. Doctors stopped mid-sentence. Halden, standing near the back of the crowd where he'd come to watch the credentialing fallout play out, went completely still. "Kingfisher," the boy said again, louder this time, certain now. "You saved us. You saved me and Sam in the storm. You held us up so we wouldn't go under." Callie knelt slowly, one hand on each boy's shoulder, throat too tight for a moment to speak at all. "You remember that," she said softly. "It wasn't a question." "I remember your voice," the other twin, Sam, said. "You kept saying, 'I've got you, don't let go.' I never forgot it." General Whitfield crossed the space between them in 3 long strides, stars and dress blues, and years of not knowing colliding all at once with the truth standing in front of him in bright cobalt scrubs. "It was you," he said, voice rough. "On the radio, in the water. I heard your voice one time for maybe 90 seconds, and I never forgot it either. I've spent 6 years trying to find out who pulled my sons out of that water, and you've been standing in this hospital the entire time." "I didn't know it was you," Callie admitted. "Not until yesterday when they wheeled you through those doors." "You knew my call sign," the general said, disbelief and gratitude fighting for space on his face. "You knew my sons' voices before you ever heard mine, and you never said a word." "It wasn't mine to tell," Callie said. "It was yours and theirs." Holden pushed through the crowd, pale now, the incident report folder he'd been carrying suddenly looking very small in his hands. "You're telling me," he said slowly to no one in particular, "that the nurse I wrote up for insubordination is a decorated Coast Guard rescue swimmer who personally saved a 4-star general's family in open water." "That's exactly what I'm telling you," General Whitfield said, not looking at Holden at all, his eyes still fixed on Callie and the 2 boys wrapped around her. "And I'd like to know why a woman with her training was ever allowed to be treated like she didn't matter in this building." Holden opened his mouth and found nothing worth saying. The boy's mother arrived a moment later, breathless. One hand pressed to her chest as she took in the scene. She looked at Callie for a long moment, and something in her face crumbled gently, the particular grief of a debt finally, unexpectedly repaid. "I tried to find you," she said. "After the rescue, nobody would give us a name. They said the swimmer who pulled us out asked to stay anonymous." "I did," Callie said. "It wasn't about hiding from you. It was about not knowing how to be thanked for something that still visits me at night." The mother reached out and took both of Callie's hands in hers, steady despite the tears standing in her eyes. "Thank you isn't enough. It was never going to be enough, but thank you." Around them, the corridor stayed frozen in that particular hush hospitals rarely hold. Uniforms and scrubs and one working dog all facing the same direction, toward a woman in bright cobalt blue who had just become, in the space of one whispered call sign, someone entirely different than the nurse they thought they knew. Coyle called for order gently, ushering the crowd back to a respectful distance, though nobody in that hallway moved very far or very fast. General Whitfield knelt to his son's level, one hand on each small shoulder, and looked up at Callie with an expression she recognized from the man's voice on the radio 6 years earlier. Steady, grateful, entirely without pretense. "Your full name," he said. "Your real one, if I may." "Callie Wren Marsh," she said. "Petty Officer First Class, United States Coast Guard, retired. Rescue swimmer, Sector Pacific Northwest." "I'd like the record corrected," the general said, straightening. "You were never properly credited for that rescue. I intend to fix that starting today, whether you want the recognition or not." "I didn't do it for recognition," Callie said. "I know that better than anyone," Whitfield said. "I spent 4 months trying to track down the swimmer who saved my family. Every request came back sealed. I assumed I'd never get an answer. I never imagined the answer would be treating patients 40 minutes from my own base, 3 years running, and nobody thought to mention it." "Nobody knew," Callie said. "That was the point of leaving it behind." "I know," he said. "That's usually how you find the people who deserve it most." He turned to Coyle. "This hospital nearly disciplined the woman who saved my family and my life. I'd like to understand how that almost happened." Coyle glanced at Holden, who suddenly found something fascinating to study on the floor tile. "That review is closed, effective now," Coyle said. "Ms. Marsh's actions were within her scope of training, and frankly, this hospital is lucky to have her." Holden finally spoke, voice smaller than Callie had ever heard it. "I owe you an apology. I judged you before I ever bothered to actually see you." "Most people do," Callie said, without cruelty. "It's easier than asking questions. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. It was something closer to permission for both of them to move forward without the weight of the last 3 years riding along." Eli tugged at Callie's sleeve. "Are you going to disappear again? Mom said the swimmer who saved us just vanished." Callie crouched down to his level, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I'm not disappearing," she said, "but I might be doing something different soon. Your dad's right that people deserve to know what training like mine can do, and maybe it's time I stopped hiding that." In the weeks that followed, Callie didn't return to active military service, and she didn't stay quietly in the shadows at Ashgrove either. She accepted a position developing a tactical trauma training program for civilian ER staff working near military installations, teaching nurses and residents the field techniques that had saved a general's life in under 90 seconds. Holden was the first name on the list to attend. She kept her job on the floor too, 3 shifts a week, because being just a nurse had never actually been a disguise. It had been true the whole time, only one part of a fuller truth she'd finally stopped hiding. Priya became the second person, after Coyle, to hear the whole story from start to finish, over coffee in the break room on a slow Tuesday afternoon. She listened without interrupting, and when Callie finished, she only said one thing. "I always wondered why your hands never shook during a code. Now I know it's because you'd already survived worse than any of us could imagine." "Everyone's hands shake eventually," Callie said. "Mine just wait until nobody's watching." The Whitfield twins visited every few months, their standing invitation Callie never once turned down. Eli kept a small silver wing pin of his own now, a gift from Callie, worn proudly on his backpack strap. Sam had started asking questions about the Coast Guard Academy, years too young to apply, old enough to already know what he wanted. On quiet nights, Callie still thought about the boy she hadn't been able to save, the one whose silence on the radio still visited her sometimes. She'd stopped believing that saving the Whitfield twins erased that loss. It didn't work that way. But it stood beside it now, instead of underneath it, and that was its own kind of healing. Holden changed too, slowly, the way people do when they're forced to see someone clearly for the first time. He stopped assuming competence lived only where credentials were loudly announced. He started asking questions instead of delivering verdicts. It wasn't a complete transformation. Nothing ever is. But it was a start. And a start was more than Callie had expected from him 6 months earlier. Respect, she'd learned a long time ago in cold water and worse weather, was never something a title handed you automatically. It was something you earned, quietly, one saved life at a time, whether or not anyone ever knew your name for it. She'd spent all that time believing her story ended the moment she walked away from the water. It hadn't ended at all. It had just been waiting for the right hallway, the right voices, and 2 small boys brave enough to call her by the only name that had ever truly belonged to her. The end. There's a particular kind of quiet that follows a life spent proving yourself twice, once in the moment, and again to anyone who never bothered to look closely the first time. Callie Marsh spent years believing her greatest rescue was something to bury, not something to be known for, because the world had taught her that competence and humility couldn't share the same hallway. It took 2 small boys, brave enough to say a forgotten name out loud, to show her they'd never needed to be separate at all. The lesson isn't really about rank, or call signs, or the 4 stars on a uniform. It's about how easily we decide who someone is before we've asked who they've been, and how much we miss when we let a first impression close a door that should have stayed open. Somewhere near you, right now, there's probably a version of Callie, quiet, underestimated, carrying more than anyone around them realizes. Maybe it's worth asking a few more questions before deciding you already know their story. If this one stayed with you, tell me which moment hit hardest down in the comments, and let me know where you're tuning in from. Subscribe for more stories like this one, and if you've got a friend who needs a reminder that quiet people often carry the loudest history, go ahead and hype this video their way. See you in the next one.